$50, he said. Cash. The whole town of Ashford Bend went silent, because 30 seconds ago the auctioneer had been trying to get $10 for the woman standing barefoot on that platform, with her wrists roped together and her own mother turned away in the crowd. Eliza Hale didn't weep, didn't beg, just stood there in the August dust while strangers decided what she was worth and waited for the worst. She never expected a stranger to walk out of the shadows and change everything with 2 words. By sunset, she was on his ranch. By the end of the week, she would be his wife. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Eliza's story travels. Subscribe and stay until the very end. You won't regret it. The auctioneer's gavel had been coming down all morning on things nobody wanted. Broken wagon wheels, a rusted-out plow, 3 crates of salvage lumber warped beyond use. Pritchard worked through his list with the cheerful efficiency of a man who genuinely loved his job, and the crowd of Ashford Bend had turned out the way they always did for the Tuesday auction. Not because they needed anything, but because watching other people's misfortune was the closest thing this town had to entertainment. Then Pritchard cleared his throat and announced Lot 47, and the entire square went quiet in a way that felt less like respect and more like hunger. One woman. Pritchard read from his ledger, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of a man trying to make something ugly sound routine. Age 39, able-bodied, no visible defects, sold as is, no returns. Eliza didn't flinch when the laughter rolled through the crowd. She'd spent 22 years learning not to flinch. She stood straight, her chin level, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the heads of the people who'd come to watch her be sold, and she thought, "This is the last time. Whatever happens today, this is the very last time." The rope around her wrists was new hemp rough yellow, tied by hands that hadn't bothered to be careful. Her dress was so old it had passed through every color it had ever been, and arrived finally at nothing a kind of tired gray that matched exactly how she felt. Her feet were bare. She'd stopped noticing that an hour ago. What she noticed instead were the faces. Mr. Feldman from the general store, arms folded across his chest, like a man sitting in judgment at church. The Yancey women mother and daughter wearing matching expressions of refined disgust, the kind that takes years to perfect. A cluster of ranch hands in the back, young men with sunburned necks and flat eyes that looked at her the way men looked at livestock. They were calculating the work left in. And her mother. Martha Hale stood near the blacksmith shop, almost hidden, her face carved into something that had no name in the human dictionary of expressions. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It wasn't grief. It was something worse than both the look of a woman who had made her decision, filed it away, and closed the drawer. She didn't meet Eliza's eyes. She hadn't met them in 3 years, not since the morning she'd sat across a table from 2 men from the county office and signed the papers that made this moment possible. Not since she'd looked at her only daughter and said very quietly, "You brought shame on this family, and I will not carry it anymore." Eliza had tried to argue, had tried to explain, had tried to make her mother see her as something other than a mistake that needed correcting. She'd stopped trying a long time ago. "We'll open the bidding at $50, Pritchard announced. Silence. A horse stamped somewhere behind the crowd. A child said something, and its mother hushed it. Pritchard adjusted his smile. 40 then. She's got years of good work in her yet. Knows her way around a kitchen. Strong back. $40 gentleman who'll start us off. More silence. Eliza felt something cold move through her chest. Not quite fear, not quite relief. It was the sensation of falling and not being able to tell how far down the ground was. 30. Pritchard tried, and now the polish was wearing off his voice, the showman's confidence developing hairline cracks. $30. That's cheaper than a good mule, and she'll complain less. The laughter this time was louder, meaner. Someone in the crowd called out, "Even a mule's got more sense than to end up where she did." Eliza's jaw tightened. She didn't look for the voice. She'd learned that particular lesson early. Looking for the source of cruelty only invited more of it. You kept your eyes forward. You kept your face still. You let them have their moment, and you waited for it to pass. 20. Pritchard's voice had gone flat. The showman was gone entirely, now replaced by a bureaucrat trying to close out a line item. $20. Who'll give me 20? Hiram Colfax stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. Eliza knew him. Everyone in Ashford Bend knew Colfax a cattle buyer, who'd made his money the way men like him always did, by understanding that the world was full of things that could be bought cheap and sold dear if you had no particular feelings about the things themselves. He was thick through the middle and florid-faced, a man whose prosperity sat on him like a coat that didn't quite fit. He looked at Eliza the way he'd look at a cow at market. Calculating. Final. She ain't worth 20 in script, he said loud enough to make sure everyone heard him. I'll give 10, and I'll tell you right now that's charity. Pritchard's face went red. Mr. Colfax, we are discussing a human being. You said, as is no returns. Colfax grinned. That's livestock talk, Pritchard. Can't dress it up and undress it at the same time. The crowd murmured. There was a line even in Ashford Bend between commerce and something darker, and Colfax was standing right on top of it in muddy boots. Eliza looked at the mountains beyond the edge of town. Blue-gray and enormous, they rose above everything. The way indifferent things rise above the problems of small petty creatures. She had a sudden fierce vision of walking toward them. Just walking. Until her legs gave out. Until the country took her. It would be cleaner than this. Do I hear 10? Pritchard's gavel was raised. His face had gone hollow. $10 going once. 50. The word landed in the square like a stone dropped in still water, and the ripples went all the way to the edges of the crowd. Heads turned. Eliza's heart, which had gone numb and distant somewhere around the $20 mark, suddenly kicked hard against her ribs. A man stepped forward from the shade of the hardware store awning. He was tall, maybe 40, with the kind of lean build that came from years of hard work and sparse meals rather than any particular design. His clothes were clean, but lived-in canvas trousers, a cotton shirt with careful patches at both elbows, boots that had been resoled so many times the original leather was just a memory. He wore his hat low enough that most of his face was in shadow. He wasn't looking at Eliza. He was looking at Pritchard. $50, he said again. Cash. Pritchard blinked. Mr. Reed, I wasn't aware you were. That is, we didn't expect... Do you want it or not? Yes, of course. The gavel came down so fast it was almost frantic. Sold to Mr. Jonah Reed for $50. Transaction to be completed at the clerk's office immediately. The crowd broke apart slowly, the way crowds do when the spectacle they came for didn't quite deliver. Some looked disappointed. Some looked relieved, as if the transaction had crossed a line they hadn't meant to cross, and having it over allowed them to forget they'd crossed it at all. Jonah Reed climbed the 3 steps to the platform, with the careful economy of a man who didn't waste movement. Up close, Eliza could see the gray threading through his dark hair, a scar that ran from his left eyebrow up into his hairline hands that were all callous and old work. He didn't meet her eyes. He reached for the rope binding her wrists and worked at the knots with fingers that were efficient and entirely impersonal. "Can you walk?" he asked. His voice was rough, low. Eliza found her own voice. "Yes." The rope fell away. Her wrists were ringed with red marks, the weave of the hemp pressed deep into her skin. She rubbed at them automatically, feeling the blood return in tiny, painful pulses. Jonah stepped back, gave her space. "There's a wagon around the side of the hardware store," he said. "I'll settle the paperwork. Wait there." He didn't say it like an order. He said it like information. "Here is the next step. Here is where you need to be." Then he turned and walked toward the clerk's office without looking back to see if she'd follow. Eliza stood on the platform alone. Pritchard was already shuffling papers for the next lot. Below her the square was emptying. A few people still watched, some openly, some pretending they weren't, and among them she saw Hiram Colfax. He was watching Jonah Reed's retreating back with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of a man who'd been outbid on something he'd decided was already his. She filed that away, tucked it somewhere she'd remember it. Then she climbed down from the platform and walked around the corner of the hardware store. The wagon was old, but maintained the wood sanded smooth from years of use, the wheels true. A buckskin gelding stood in the traces, patient and still regarding her with large, incurious eyes. Eliza stopped a few feet from the wagon and looked at it for a long moment. She looked at the horse. She looked at the empty driver's seat. She could run. The thought rose up sharp and clear. She could disappear into the alleys behind the main street. Find the river road. Follow it north until she hit the next town or the one after that, until she was far enough away that no one knew her name or her history. She stood with that thought for a moment. Then she thought about what came after the running no money, no horse, no one in the world who'd hide her. And when they caught her, and they would catch her, the next conversation wouldn't happen on an auction block. It would happen somewhere darker, with no witnesses, no pretense of legality. At least the auction had been public. At least there were rules. She walked to the back of the wagon and sat on the lowered gate, her legs dangling, her hands folded in her lap. And she waited. Jonah returned 15 minutes later with a rolled paper under one arm. He moved around to the driver's side without speaking, climbed up, settled the reins. Then he paused. "You can sit up here if you want," he said, not turning around. "Or stay where you are. Your choice." The last two words hung in the warm afternoon air between them. Your choice. Eliza stared at the back of his head. She thought about those words, how long it had been since anyone had offered her one. How strange it felt to hold a choice in her hands, and not immediately be afraid of it. She stood, walked along the side of the wagon, climbed up onto the seat beside him. He shifted slightly to make room the way you'd shift for a stranger on a narrow bench. He didn't help her, but he didn't make her feel unwelcome either. The buckboard dipped under their combined weight, then settled. Jonah clicked his tongue. The horse leaned into the traces. They rolled out of Ashford Bend, heading west. She waited for him to speak first. He didn't. After the first mile, she understood that silence was simply how he moved through the world. Not hostile, not cold, just quiet. The way mountains were quiet. Taking up space without announcing it. After an hour, he reached under the seat and pulled out a canteen. He drank, then held it out to her without looking at her. She hesitated. Then she took it. The water was warm, faintly metallic, but it hit the back of her dusty throat like grace. "Thank you," she said, handing it back. He nodded once, stowed the canteen, that was all. But something about the gesture, the automatic, unthinking offering of it, as if her thirst were simply a fact that required addressing, made something tighten in Eliza's chest in a way she didn't entirely understand. They climbed into higher country as the afternoon wore on. The land changed around them, the flat prairie giving way to scrub and juniper. The air thinning and cooling, the mountains resolving from blue haze into solid rock. Eliza watched it all and tried not to think about what came next. She thought about it anyway. She thought about Colfax's face when Jonah had outbid him. The particular quality of that expression, not just frustrated, but affronted, as if something he'd already taken possession of in his mind had been removed without permission. Men like Colfax didn't let things go. That was how they'd gotten where they were. "Another hour," Jonah said suddenly. She startled slightly. She'd almost forgotten he could speak. "We'll be there before dark." He paused. "It's not much. The ranch. I want you to know that before you see it, so you're not—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider. "It's functional. That's what it is." "Functional is fine," Eliza said. He glanced at her, then just briefly, and she caught a flash of something in his eyes. Surprise, maybe that she hadn't argued or complained. Then he looked back at the road. "There's a room," he said. "In the house. It's small, but it's got a door, and the door latches from the inside." "All right. I'm saying it latches from the inside so the latch is on your side." He was working at the words the way he'd worked at the rope on her wrists, methodical, careful. I won't come in without you asking me to. Eliza turned to look at his profile, the weathered jaw, the hat brim shadowing his eyes. Why? She asked. Because you're a person. The words came out flat, almost frustrated, like he'd been arguing this with himself for a while and was tired of it. Not livestock. People need a place that's theirs. She stared at him for a long moment. Why did you bid at all? She asked. You could have let it go. Colfax would have taken it for $10 and saved you $50. Jonah's jaw worked. The horse plodded on through the late afternoon heat, and for a moment she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then quietly, because no one else would, and I know what it's like to be the thing nobody wants. The words landed somewhere deep. Eliza looked away, back at the road unrolling ahead of them, at the mountains growing larger against the sky. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. And somehow, in the silence that followed, something shifted between them, something small and tentative, like the first breath after holding it too long. The ranch sat in a shallow valley folded between rising land, a creek cutting through the eastern edge. The buildings were small and weathered, a house barely bigger than a cabin, a barn that leaned fractionally south, a corral with rails replaced in mismatched wood, a chicken coop listing slightly to one side. It wasn't much, but it was kept. That was the thing Eliza noticed first. The fences were mended. The yard was clear. The garden plot near the house looked stressed and heat-battered, but the plants were alive, every one of them fighting for it. Jonah pulled the wagon to a stop and set the brake. He sat for a moment, hands on his knees, looking at his property, the way a man looks at something he's been carrying for so long he's forgotten what it weighed before. Well, he said. He climbed down, unhitched. The horse led it to the corral. Eliza stood in the yard and watched him work the way he checked the gelding's hooves, without being asked, the way he ran a hand down the horse's neck before turning away. There was care in it, real care, the kind that was just habit second nature, so woven into how he moved through the world, he probably didn't notice it anymore. He crossed the yard to where she stood. The last light of the day caught his eyes and turned them a shade lighter, not quite brown, not quite amber. He looked at her directly for the first time since the platform. I meant what I said about the room, he said. The latch is on your side. That's not going to change. What do you want from me? She asked, direct, flat. She'd stopped being indirect about the things that mattered years ago. He turned and walked to the house, started a fire in the stove with the practiced movements of a man who lived alone. When the kindling caught and the small room began to warm, he straightened and faced her. Help with the ranch, he said. Cooking, mending the garden. In exchange, a roof, food, and that room. When the 7 years are done, you walk away free. That's the whole deal. That's all? That's all. Men say that. Her voice was flat. And then the sun goes down. Something moved across his face. Not anger, not defensiveness. Something older. Something that had been carried a long time. My wife's name was Sarah, he said. We were married 8 years. He was quiet for a moment, and the silence had weight to it. She died 2 years ago. Fever. 3 days from fine to gone. He looked at the floor. The last thing she said to me was, don't blame yourself. I've been failing at that ever since. Eliza waited. I made her a promise, he said. Standing at her grave, I promised I would never use my size or my position to take what wasn't given freely. I've kept that promise for 2 years. He looked up, and his eyes were fierce. I'll keep it the rest of my life. So no, the sun is not going to change my mind. You can believe that, or you can wait and see. Either way, it's the truth. The fire popped. Outside, a nightbird started up low and mournful. Eliza looked at this man, this worn, grieving, fiercely principled man, and searched for the lie. The way she'd been searching for lies her whole life, trained by experience to expect them. She couldn't find one. I want to believe you, she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in years. "Then start there," he replied, "and we'll see where it goes." He moved to the shelves, pulled down a tin of coffee. "I'll make supper. Go rest." Eliza went to her room, closed the door. Her hand hovered over the latch, the small iron bar, simple final. After a long moment she said it. The click was barely a sound, but it was the loudest thing she'd heard all day. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed both hands flat on the rough wool blanket and listened. Through the thin wall she could hear Jonah moving in the kitchen, the clank of a pot, the scrape of a spoon, the ordinary sounds of someone making a meal. She lay back, stared at the ceiling. In 7 years, she would be 46 years old, past the age of most things she'd once wanted. But she would be free if he kept his word, if this was what it seemed to be, if the world hadn't found one more way to break her. She closed her eyes. For the first time in longer than she could measure, she felt something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite despair. It was the space between them. The narrow, terrifying, precious space between them. Possibility. She didn't trust it yet, but it was there. And that night, listening to the sounds of Jonah Reed moving through the house, banking the fire, settling in the quiet close of his bedroom door, Eliza Hale let herself breathe. Just breathe. Just that. Just that for now. The first morning came gray and cold, the kind of quiet that sits in a house like a held breath. Eliza was awake before the light. Old habit years of living in other people's houses had trained her body to rise before it was asked to be useful before she could be found wanting. She lay still for a moment listening. The main room was empty. Jonah's door was closed. Somewhere outside, a horse stamped once and went quiet. She dressed in the same thin shift she'd worn yesterday. It was the only thing she owned. She smoothed the wrinkles with her hands, a useless gesture that she made anyway because small dignities were still dignities. When she unlatched her door and stepped out, she found a tin cup on the table, a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth, and a note in blocky, careful handwriting. Eat. Work in the barn. Not a command. Information. Here is the next step. She ate the cornbread standing at the table, tasting salt and the faint ghost of honey. When she finished, she washed the cup and plate in the basin, dried them on the rag that hung from the nail, put them back exactly where she'd found them. Then she went outside. The barn doors were open. Inside, she found Jonah already deep in the work of mucking a stall, his shirt dark with sweat, despite the morning chill, the pitchfork rising and falling with the rhythm of a man who'd done this 10,000 times. He glanced up when her shadow crossed the threshold, then went back to work. "Boots by the door," he said, jerking his chin toward a corner. "Smaller pair. Won't do to have you walking barefoot. Step on a nail out here, you'll be useless for a week." Eliza looked at the boots. Worn leather laces, frayed, but carefully oiled, kept dry. She picked one up and turned it over in her hands. "Whose were these?" His shoulders went stiff. Just for a second. "My wife's." The words hit the air between them and stayed there. Eliza set the boot down, the way you set down something breakable. "I don't want to wear them if they're something you're keeping. They're boots." His voice went flat and deliberate, the flatness of a man closing a door. "She's not coming back for them. You need something on your feet. That's the whole story." He pushed the wheelbarrow out through the side door before she could respond, leaving her alone with the boots and the knowledge of the woman who'd worn them. She sat on an overturned bucket and pulled them on. They were slightly too big, but the leather was soft and broken in shape to feet that had walked this same ground, worked this same dirt. She stood, took a few steps. It was the strangest feeling wearing someone else's life on your feet and not knowing yet whether it fit. When Jonah came back, he stopped short at the sight of her standing in the middle of the barn. His eyes dropped to the boots, and something crossed his face so fast she almost missed it. Pain. Memory. Gone. "They fit?" he asked. "Well enough." "Good." He grabbed the pitchfork. "You know chickens. Feed them, gather the eggs. Watch out for the mean ones." "There's a red hen." He said it without inflection. "She's mean." It might have been a warning. It might have been the closest thing to a joke he knew how to make. Eliza couldn't tell yet, but she nodded and headed for the chicken coop, grateful for something clear-edged and simple, a task with a beginning and an end. The red hen was everything Jonah had promised. She stood her ground in the run with the particular righteousness of a creature that has decided it owns everything it can see, and fixed Eliza with one orange eye, full of personal grievance. "We don't have to be friends," Eliza told her, "but I'm getting those eggs." The hen made a sound like gravel in a coffee can. When Eliza scattered the feed, the bird joined the scramble like every other chicken, and Eliza slipped into the coop and came out with 6 eggs cradled carefully. On her way out, the red hen pecked her ankle hard enough to sting, not hard enough to break skin. "Noted," Eliza said, and latched the gate. She brought the eggs to the house, washed them, set them in a bowl on the shelf. Then she stood in the middle of the main room and looked around with the eyes of a woman who has spent her life cleaning up after other people's carelessness. The floor needed sweeping. The windows hadn't been washed in months. The whole place had the feel of a house maintained, but not tended, kept alive out of necessity, but nobody had tried to make it a home in a long time. She found a broom and started with the floor. By the time Jonah came in for the midday meal, she had swept the floors, washed every window until the mountains showed sharp through the glass, and had beans simmering on the stove with salt pork and wild onions she'd pulled from the creek bank. He stopped in the doorway, stood there. "You didn't have to do all this." Eliza didn't turn from the stove. "You said you wanted help with the ranch." "I meant the stock, the fields. I know what you meant." She did turn then, wooden spoon in hand, because some things needed to be said face to face. "But if I'm going to live here, I'd rather it not look like a place where people gave up." She braced herself. 22 years of living in other people's houses had taught her that speaking freely always had a cost. Jonah just looked at her, a long measuring look. Then he nodded once and went to wash his hands. "Fair enough," he said. They ate across from each other at the small table, and the silence this time had a different texture than the silence in the wagon, less like two strangers and more like two people learning the shape of each other's presence. Halfway through the meal, Jonah said without preamble, "Stock needs moving to the upper pasture tomorrow. You ever worked cattle?" "No." "Horses?" "I can ride if the horse is willing and the saddle is secure." That almost smile crossed his face again, so brief she'd have missed it blinking. "That'll do. I've got a mare steady as they come. You'll help me push the herd up the valley." Eliza's stomach nodded. She'd lived her whole life in towns and kitchens in narrow rooms, but she said, "All right," because what else was there to say? That afternoon, she worked the garden. The plants were struggling heat, and lack of rain had taken their toll. But they were alive, and alive meant there was still something to work with. She hauled water from the creek in a bucket, trip after trip, until her shoulders burned, and she talked to the plants, the way her grandmother had done, low and steady words that weren't really words, but were really just presence. "You've made it this far," she told a wilting tomato vine. "Don't quit on me now." She was kneeling at the creek bank, washing her face in the snow-melt cold of it, when she heard his boots on the ground behind her. "You'll work yourself sick," Jonah said. She stood, water dripping from her chin. "I've worked through worse." "Maybe, but you don't have to prove anything here." "Don't I?" The question came out before she could catch it, and she watched his expression shift, not to anger, but to something guarded, careful. "No," he said quietly. "You don't. Men always say that." She kept her voice flat, controlled. "And then they change their minds when the sun goes down." A long silence. Jonah looked away toward the mountains, and when he spoke his voice was rough in a different way than usual. Not the roughness of a man who doesn't talk much, but the roughness of a man talking about something that costs him. "Sarah died in that house," he said, "in our bed, because I was too proud to ride for a doctor when she first got sick, thought I could handle it. Thought it was just a cold thought. Asking for help was the same as admitting I'd failed at something." He stopped, swallowed. She was 3 days from fine to gone, and the last thing she told me was not to blame myself. She knew me well enough to know I would. He turned back to look at Eliza, and his eyes were fierce, nearly desperate. I made her a promise at her grave. I've kept it for 2 years. I will keep it until I'm in the ground next to her. He paused. So no, I won't change my mind when the sun goes down. You can believe me, or you can wait and see. But that's the truth. Eliza looked at him for a long time, searching the way she always searched for the crack in the story, the place where the lie lived. She didn't find one. I want to believe you, she said, quietly, like a confession. Then start there, Jonah said, and we'll see where it goes. He picked up the coil of rope he'd left on the bank and headed back toward the barn. Eliza watched him go. The wind moved through the pine trees above the creek, carrying cold down from the peaks. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum, feeling her own heartbeat. Start there. It wasn't much. But it was the first solid thing she'd been offered in a very long time. That night she made supper from what she could find. Beans again, biscuits from flour and lard, dried apples stewed with sugar. When Jonah came in from the evening chores and saw the table, his eyebrows rose. You didn't have to go to all this trouble. It's supper, Eliza said. Sit down before it gets cold. They ate, and for the first time the silence felt less like distance, and more like two people who had said enough for one day and were resting in the space that remained. Jonah ate like a man who'd forgotten what regular meals felt like, taking seconds of everything, sopping up the last of the bean liquid with the last of his biscuit. You're a good cook, he said when his plate was clean. I'm adequate, there's a difference. Not from where I'm sitting. Something warm moved through Eliza's chest. Not pride exactly, but adjacent to it. She stood to clear the table, and Jonah reached out and caught her wrist. Gently. His fingers barely touched her skin, the way you'd catch something fragile you were afraid of crushing. I'll do the washing up, he said. You worked all day. Rest. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, at the calluses and the old scars, at the careful way he held like he was afraid of holding too tight. Then she looked at his face, and there was nothing there but exhaustion and a quiet, stubborn respect. All right, she said. He let her go. She went to her room and lay on the narrow bed and listened to him move through the house, washing dishes, banking the fire, the soft close of his bedroom door. She stared at the ceiling and thought about all the men who had looked at her over the years and seen something to use. Jonah Reed looked at her and saw someone who knew how to work. Someone who deserved a door with a latch. It wasn't love. It wasn't even close to love. But it was more than she'd had in 22 years, and that night, for the first time in longer than she could count, Eliza Hale fell asleep without dreading the morning. The days built themselves into a rhythm after that, each one a little steadier than the last. She'd wake before dawn, find the coffee already made, and Jonah already gone to whatever needed doing first. She'd gather eggs, scatter feed, tend the garden. She'd cook. She'd mend the shirts she found in a basket near the stove, his shirts work-worn and honestly patched, the kind of mending that told you everything about a man's life without him saying a word. The house changed under her hands. A jar of wildflowers on the table. The windows clear enough to see weather coming. The floor swept clean every evening. The stove scrubbed free of old grease. Small things. But small things were how homes got made. Then came the morning of the cattle drive, and small things gave way to something larger. Jonah had the horses saddled before dawn. The mare he'd chosen for Eliza was gray, with the kind of calm, heavy-lidded patience that belonged to an animal that had seen everything, and decided none of it was worth panic. Her name was Dove. She'll take care of you, Jonah said, checking the cinch on Eliza's saddle. Let her. Don't fight her. She knows this land better than either of us. Eliza put her foot in the stirrup and hauled herself up with more determination than grace. The saddle was real and solid under her, and Dove stood perfectly still, ears flicking back once as if to say, I've got you, just don't do anything foolish. They pushed 30 head up the valley in the early morning light. The cattle had their own opinions about the whole enterprise, and those opinions changed every 2 minutes. Eliza spent the better part of the morning riding hard arcs around strays, who'd decided the brush looked more interesting than the rest of the herd, her thighs burning from gripping the saddle, her back screaming from muscles that had never been asked to do this particular thing. But she stayed on. When the last animal pushed through the upper pasture gate and Jonah swung it shut, he sat his horse and looked at the herd settling into the new grass, and he didn't look at Eliza, but he said, "You did good. Most first-timers fall off at least once." "I wanted to," Eliza said honestly. "About 6 times." And Jonah Reed laughed. It was a short sound, rough and a little rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a while. But it was real, and it changed his face entirely, took 10 years off. It turned him for a moment into someone who hadn't yet learned to carry grief like a second skeleton. Eliza felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay there. They rode back slower, letting the horses pick their way in the afternoon heat. It was the most relaxed Eliza had felt in years, exhausted in her body, but easy in her mind, in a way that almost alarmed her, because ease was something she'd learned not to trust. "Why did you stay in Ashford Bend?" Jonah asked. "All those years. Why not leave?" Eliza watched Dove's ears flick at a passing fly. "I was going to. Had almost enough saved for a train ticket East Philadelphia maybe. Somewhere big enough to disappear into." She paused. "Then my mother's creditors came calling. She'd been gambling. Quiet debts the kind respectable widows weren't supposed to have. When she couldn't pay, she offered them the only thing she had left." "She offered you. She signed the papers before I even knew what was happening. 7 years of my labor to cover what she owed." Eliza kept her voice level. "I had no money, no horse, no one who'd hide me. And if I'd run and they'd caught me, it would have been worse. At least this way there's an end to it. 7 years and I'm free. Really free." "5 years now," Jonah said. "You've got 5 years left." "I know." "And then, I don't know," Eliza said. "I try not to think that far. Just get through today, then tomorrow." "That's a hard way to live." "It's the only way I know how." They rode the rest of the way in silence, and when they reached the ranch, Eliza dismounted and almost buckled. Every muscle in her body had registered a formal complaint. She took care of Dove anyway, unsaddle brush check hooves moving on pure stubbornness. That night, she cooked supper standing at the stove because sitting down and getting back up felt like a worse proposition. Jonah noticed. Of course he noticed. "Salve in the barn," he said after they'd eaten. "Tin with a red lid. Shelf by the door. Use it." "I'm fine." "You're not, and there's no shame in it." He stood, carried his plate to the basin, and his voice took on the flat tone he used when he was done arguing. "Pride's a luxury out here. Use what works." He went to his room. Eliza sat at the table for another minute, hating that he was right. Then she limped out to the barn in the gathering dark, found the tin exactly where he'd said it would be, and brought it back to her room. The salve smelled of mint, and something sharp and medicinal. It burned first, then cooled, then settled into a deep spreading warmth that pulled the worst edge off the pain. She lay in her narrow bed and listened to the night, an owl, the creak of settling wood, the wind working its way down from the high country, and thought about how strange it was. How this place she'd been sold into like an animal was starting to feel less like a cage and more like something she didn't quite have a word for yet. Not home. Too soon for that. Maybe not ever. But not a prison either. Somewhere in the uncertain country between the two, she fell asleep. The trouble came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after she'd arrived, and it came riding up the valley road with its hat on straight, and its purpose already decided. Eliza was in the garden when she heard the horses, 2, maybe 3, moving at a pace that wasn't casual. She straightened and felt her stomach drop the way it always dropped when the world sent her a warning she didn't yet understand. Jonah came out of the barn with a hammer still in his hand. His eyes found hers across the yard. Something passed between them. No words, no need for them. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. 2 riders came into the yard. Eliza recognized them both. Hiram Colfax. And behind him Porter, who served as deputy when the town needed one, and as Colfax's hired weight the rest of the time. Colfax sat his horse the way he always sat. Everything like the ground existed for the purpose of being below him. His eyes went straight to Eliza with an expression that made her feel like she was back on the platform, roped and barefoot, and hadn't moved an inch. "Read," he said. No greeting. "We need to talk about the woman." Jonah set the hammer carefully against the barn wall. "I don't have any property that concerns you, Colfax. The contract." Colfax leaned forward. "There have been questions raised about the legality of the sale. Some folks are saying the auction should have been for the contract itself, the right to her labor, not for her person. That maybe what you bought isn't as clean as you think. The sale was legal. Pritchard ran it. The clerk recorded it. I paid cash." Jonah's voice was level, but Eliza could see his hands had gone still at his sides, the particular stillness of a man keeping himself controlled. "What questions?" Porter shifted in his saddle, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Colfax smiled, and the smile was the ugliest thing about him, uglier than his words, uglier than his eyes. "Contract like that one can be sold, transferred, and I'm prepared to offer you $60 to take it off your hands. That's 10 more than you paid." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Eliza stood in the garden with dirt on her hands and felt the world narrow down to the space between these two men and whatever Jonah was about to say. "She's not for sale," Jonah said quietly. "Everything's for sale, Reed. You of all people ought to know that." I said no. Colfax dropped the false friendliness like shedding a coat he'd never needed. "There's talk in town. Talk about a man living alone with a woman of her reputation. Might be the territorial judge would want to review the arrangement. Make sure everything's being handled according to law and decency." He let the implication sit. "And if he found the situation wasn't quite appropriate, get off my land." Jonah's voice cut clean through the sentence. Just 4 words, but they hit the air like something physical. "Now," he added. Porter cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed, we're only trying to—" "I know exactly what you're trying to do." Jonah took 1 step forward, and something in his bearing, the absolute stillness of it, the iron underneath, made both men's horses shift. "You're trying to frighten me into handing over a contract you want so you can do whatever you want with a woman you think has no one to stand up for her." He looked at Colfax directly, not blinking. "It's not happening. Not today. Not ever. You want to bring the real law, bring a judge, bring every piece of paper in the territory, bring it all. But you will get off my land right now." Colfax's face had gone the color of brick. For a moment, Eliza thought he'd push it. Thought something would crack open here in this yard that couldn't be uncracked. Then Porter touched his arm and said something too low to hear, and after a long, ugly pause, Colfax jerked his reins and wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he said, riding out. "That woman's got debts to pay. One way or another, they'll get paid." They watched the riders go until the sound of hoofbeats dissolved into the afternoon. Then Jonah turned to face her, and his expression had settled back into something quieter, something tired. "You all right?" he asked. Eliza's hands were trembling. She pressed them against her dress. What did he mean, debts to pay? He meant he wants what he tried to buy for $10, and he's angry he didn't get it. Jonah crossed the yard toward her, his steps careful, deliberate. "Don't listen to him. The contract is legal. I checked with the clerk before I bid. But if he takes it to a judge, then we'll fight it." He stopped a few feet away and held her gaze. "Together." "Why?" She heard her own voice, thin and desperate. "Why fight for me? You could take the $60. You could—" "I gave you my word." His voice didn't rise, didn't soften. It was simply absolute. "I told you that you'd have a place here, that you'd be safe. I meant it. Words are cheap. Not mine. Not when it comes to this." Eliza looked at him, this man who'd stood between her and Colfax's ugliness without a second's hesitation, who'd paid $50 for a woman no one else would bid 10 on, who made coffee in the mornings before she woke, and offered salve for her tired muscles, and still slept behind his own closed door every single night. She wanted to say something, wanted to tell him what this meant, what it cost to be defended by someone, what it felt like to have your name used by someone who wasn't using it against you. But the sky chose that moment to flash white. She looked up. Dark clouds rolling in from the west, moving fast, already swallowing the peaks whole. The wind turned cold in an instant, carrying the smell of electricity, and something coming that wouldn't be gentle. Jonah looked up with her. "Storm," he said, and then, "A bad one. We need to move." They moved fast. Jonah to the corral for the horses, Eliza to the chicken coop, to latch it tight. The light went wrong, greenish and low, and the wind was bending things it shouldn't have been bending. By the time she'd secured the chickens and run back across the yard, the first drops were falling fat cold deliberate. Then the sky opened entirely. It came sideways, driven by a wind that felt like it had a personal grievance. Eliza ran for the barn and heard underneath the roar of it a sound like the world splitting at a seam. A crack so deep she felt it in her molars, and then the heavy earth-shaking crash of something enormous falling. A pine tree at the edge of the property had gone down across the corral fence. The horses screamed. Jonah was already running for the corral, and Eliza was running after him, before she'd decided to. Because there was no deciding in it, it was just movement, just her feet going where they needed to go. Through the wall of rain she could see Dove rearing and plunging, caught between the fallen tree and the broken fence rails. One leg tangled, eyes white with terror. Jonah grabbed for the mare's halter. Dove reared again, hooves flailing, and Jonah ducked, slipped in the mud, and went down hard, and didn't get up. Eliza ran. She hit her knees in the mud beside him, rain hammering her back. He was conscious, but dazed, blood already running from a cut above his left eye, where a hoof had caught him on the way down. "Can you stand?" she shouted over the wind. "The horse," he started. "Can you stand?" She got his arm over her shoulders and hauled. He was heavier than he looked, heavier than she'd expected, and the mud tried to keep both of them down. But she got him up, got him moving, got him to the barn door, and pushed him down onto a hay bale with both hands. He was already trying to rise again. "Stay," she said, exactly the way she'd told the red hen to stay, and grabbed a lead rope off the wall. "What are you doing?" "Something stupid." She went back into the storm. The world had gone entirely gray rain so thick it had texture and lightning cracking close enough that the thunder was simultaneous. She found Dove by sound, by the high, terrible screaming of a terrified animal, and she talked to her the way she'd talked to the tomato plants, low and steady and relentless. "Easy. I've got you. Easy now, girl. I'm right here." The mare's eyes found her through the chaos, wild, white-rimmed, but found her. Eliza reached for the halter with hands she couldn't feel anymore, and worked by pure touch, buckles, broken rails, the caught leg. Each 1 inch by careful inch, while the storm tried to tear everything apart. Her fingers slipped again, found purchase. Lightning exploded directly overhead, and Dove lunged, dragging Eliza 3 steps through the mud before she got her weight back and her voice into the space between them. "No, stand. Stand, Dove." And the mare stood, trembling like she was coming apart at the seams, sides heaving, but stood. Eliza led her to the barn, one careful step at a time, talking without stopping, and when they finally stumbled through the doors, Jonah was on his feet, one hand braced against a post, blood still running down his face. "You're insane," he said. "Probably." Eliza tied Dove's lead with shaking hands. "But she's your horse. You would have done the same." Something tore overhead, a long shrieking sound of wood giving way, and part of the barn roof peeled back and disappeared into the dark. Rain poured in. The horses screamed again. "Tack room!" Jonah grabbed her arm. Now, they stumbled into the small enclosed room at the back of the barn, and he slammed the door. Darkness, clothes, and thick smelling of leather and oil. Barely room for 2 people to stand, let alone sit. They sank to the floor with their backs against the wall and listened to the storm try to destroy everything around them. In the brief silences between gusts, Jonah's breathing was rough. She could feel the warmth of him in the dark, the tension in his body, the effort of staying still when everything outside was being unmade. "Let me see the cut," she said. "Later." "Now." She reached for his face in the darkness, turned it toward the thin light leaking through the wall cracks, and he let her. The gash was deep, still bleeding freely, and his jaw was clenched against the pain he wasn't admitting. "You need stitches," she said. "When it's over." "When it's over," she agreed. A gust hit the barn like a fist, and dust sifted down from the rafters. She found herself pressed against his side, and he shifted not to close distance, but to make sure she had room, to make sure she wasn't pressed against the wall. His arm came around her shoulders, and it was nothing like ownership. It was two people taking up as little space as possible, in a world that had decided to come apart. "I'm sorry," Jonah said into the dark. "For what? For bringing you here. For putting you in the path of a man like Colfax." His voice was rough with something beyond pain. "For not being able to keep the roof on or the fence up, or—" He stopped. "For failing at this, the same way I've failed at everything else." Eliza turned toward him, though in the dark she could barely make out the shape of his face. "You stood between me and Colfax," she said. Her voice had gone fierce before she'd decided to let it. "You told him no when $60 would have made your life easier. You gave me a room with a latch and asked for nothing. You know how many men in my life have done that." "Eliza, none." The word came out hard and clean. "Not one, not ever." She felt her throat tighten and pushed through it. "I was 14 years old when Thomas Greer smiled at me. 14 and desperate to be seen as something other than Martha Hale's disappointing daughter. He said he loved me. Said we'd be married. Said all of it. And I believed him because I needed to believe someone." She drew a breath that shook. "He left when I was 17. The baby came early and died before morning. And after that, everyone in Ashford Bend decided that's what I was. Something used up. Something to be managed." The storm howled. Something crashed outside, something large. "My own mother looked at me like shame she had to hide," Eliza said. "For 22 years I tried to work hard enough, be quiet enough, be good enough for them to see me differently. And it never mattered. Nothing I did ever mattered." Jonah's arm tightened around her shoulders, not pulling her closer, just holding. "And then you bought me," she said softer now. "And I thought this is it. This is where the bottom finally falls out. But you didn't." She stopped. "You haven't." The silence that followed was different from all the other silences they'd shared. Fuller. More weight to it. "Sarah was the best person I ever knew," Jonah said, finally his voice stripped of everything but the truth. "And I failed her. Brought her out to this place and worked her too hard, and was too proud to ask for help, and when she got sick, I waited too long, because I thought I could fix it myself." He stopped, and she could feel the grief moving through him, real and physical. The last thing she said was, "Don't blame yourself. She knew me. Knew I would." Lightning lit the cracks in the walls for one white second, and Eliza saw his face, every line of it carved with a grief that had never been given anywhere to go. "So, when they were selling you," he said, "when I saw you standing on that platform and everyone treating you like you were nothing, I saw her. I saw every person the world grinds down and throws away. And I couldn't let it happen." A long pause. "I couldn't let it happen again when I could do something about it." "I'm not her," Eliza said gently. "I know." His voice was certain. "But you deserve better than what they were offering. And maybe—" He stopped. Started again. "Maybe I needed to prove I could do one thing right." They sat together in the dark in the wreckage of the storm, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind reached a pitch that felt like something ending, and somewhere above them the last of the barn roof tore completely free. Rain poured through the gaps. The horses screamed, but the tack room held, and in the darkness, Eliza made a decision. Not about forever, not about trust. Not yet. Trust was a long road, and she was only just finding the entrance. But about this moment, about the man beside her, who had stood between her and the worst of the world and asked for nothing in return. She leaned against his shoulder. He went still. Then, carefully, tentatively, he shifted to make room for her. His arms settled around her differently now. Not shelter from the storm, but something offered. Something she could choose to take or leave. She took it. They sat like that while the storm finished its work outside two people who had been broken by entirely different things and were only just beginning to understand that broken didn't have to mean finished. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion took her completely, and she slept with her head on Jonah Reed's shoulder and his coat over both of them. When she woke, the storm was gone, and everything outside needed to be rebuilt. She found she didn't mind that. She found, in fact, that she was ready to start. The storm left in silence, the way bad things sometimes do, without apology, without warning, just suddenly gone, and all its damage remaining behind like a signature. Eliza woke to pale gray light and the sound of dripping. Jonah was already awake beside her, his back against the tack room wall, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted, the dried blood on his face, dark as rust. He'd been awake for a while. She could tell by the stillness of him, the particular stillness of a man who'd been sitting with his thoughts long enough that they'd worn grooves. "Storm's past," he said quietly. They opened the tack room door to what was left of the barn. Most of the roof was gone, just gone, scattered across the valley in pieces, and the morning light came straight down through the open rafters onto wet hay and ruined feed. 2 stalls were destroyed. Water stood in the corners, but the horses were alive. Dove and the buckskin stood in what remained of their stalls, wet and miserable and entirely unharmed. And outside, when they emerged into the yard, the house was standing. Shingles missing one window, blown in but standing. Jonah surveyed the wreckage with an expression that had no despair in it. Just acknowledgement. Just a man looking at one more thing that needed doing and deciding to do it. "Well," he said, "better get to work." "We'd better get to work," Eliza corrected. He looked at her. She looked back. Something settled between them, quiet and certain, the kind of agreement that doesn't need words because both people already feel it in their bones. "First thing," she said, "that cut needs stitches." He didn't argue. That more than anything told her how much pain he was actually in. She sewed him up at the kitchen table by lamplight, using a needle she'd boiled and thread pulled from the strongest shirt she could find. 12 stitches. She'd mended enough things in her life to know how to keep her hand steady, and she kept it steady, now drawing the edges of the wound together carefully, the way you'd close something you intended to keep closed. Jonah sat perfectly still. His jaw was set, his hands flat on his thighs, and he didn't make a sound. "You've done this before," he said when she tied off the last stitch. "I've mended a lot of things." She dabbed the wound clean with a cloth. "People aren't that different from fabric. You just have to be careful with the seams." His hand came up and caught her wrist gently as she reached for the bandage roll. "Thank you." "For Dove. For this." He held her gaze. "For all of it. For not running when you had the chance, and for coming back into that storm, and for—" He stopped, seemed to decide something. "Just thank you." Eliza finished wrapping the wound without speaking. When she was done, they sat across from each other in the gray dawn light, too spent to move, too awake to sleep, listening to water drip through 12 new places in the roof. "The barn needs a new roof," Jonah said eventually. "The corral fence is destroyed. The house needs patching. I've got maybe enough lumber to fix one of those, and not enough money to buy what I'd need for the rest." He rubbed his face with both hands, careful of the fresh stitches. "I should have taken Colfax's $60. "Don't!" The word came out of Eliza sharp and immediate. "Don't you dare say that." "I'm not saying I would have. I'm saying—" "I know what you're saying." She stood, gathered the bloody cloths, her voice tight and controlled. "You're saying this place is falling apart, and you're tired, and you're afraid you've made things worse. I understand that, but don't sit there and tell me selling me to Hiram Colfax would have been the sensible answer, because you know what he wanted, and it wasn't someone to cook his meals." Jonah was quiet. "Do you know what men like Colfax do with women they think they own?" Her back was to him, hands in the basin. "I know. I've seen it. I've lived close enough to it to understand exactly what that $60 would have bought him." She turned. So say no again if he comes back. Say it as many times as you have to. But don't you ever suggest you should have said yes." A long silence. "I wasn't suggesting that," Jonah said, his voice low. "I was saying, I'm afraid I'm going to fail you the same way I failed Sarah. That this place is coming apart faster than I can hold it, and you're here because of a promise I made, and I don't know if I can keep it." The honesty of it stopped her cold. She looked at him, this man who'd taken a hoof to the face protecting his horse, who'd bought her freedom when he could barely afford his own, who sat here now in the wreckage of a storm he hadn't caused and blamed himself for it anyway. And something in her chest moved toward him, the way water moves downhill, simply and without decision. "Then we fail together," she said quietly. "But we don't give up." He looked at her for a long moment. Not yet. Not ever. Something shifted in his expression. Not hope exactly, he was too careful for hope, but the thing that comes just before it, when you've been in the dark long enough that your eyes begin to adjust. "All right," he said. "Not ever." They spent the morning assessing every inch of the damage, Eliza with a piece of charcoal and a scrap of paper, making a list in her small, careful handwriting. Jonah doing what Jonah did, moving through problems with his hands, testing each thing to find out what could be salvaged and what was simply gone. The barn structure itself was sound. The roof was a total loss, but the walls stood solid, and 2 of the 4 stalls could be repaired with what lumber remained on the property. The house needed shingles, new glass for the window, and a half-day's work on the side wall where rain had gotten into the framing. The corral would need new rails from one end to the other. Fixable. All of it. Just barely, but fixable. They were standing in the ruined barn, Eliza reading the list back aloud, when they heard a wagon coming up the valley road. Jonah's head came up. Eliza felt the old dread clench in her stomach. Colfax coming back while they were down, coming back to press whatever advantage the storm had handed him. But the wagon that crested the rise was loaded with lumber. Stacked neat bundled shingles on top. A man she didn't recognize at the reins, older, lean, with the kind of weathered face that belonged to someone who'd spent 40 years in a hard country and made his peace with it. Jonah walked out to meet him. Eliza followed close. "Jonah Reed," the man said, climbing down with the careful movements of someone whose joints had opinions. "That's me. Edward Pruitt, ranch about 8 miles north." He nodded at the lumber. "Heard about the storm from a rider passing through. Figured you'd be needing some of this." Jonah stared at the wagon. "I can't pay for it right now. Didn't ask for payment." Pruitt lit a cigarette with practiced calm. "Storm got my north pasture fence a few weeks back. You and your wife come help me mend it when you're back on your feet. We'll call it square." Eliza opened her mouth to explain that she wasn't his wife, that this was a contracted arrangement, that the word wife was a convenience Jonah had reached for in town, and she'd let stand without exactly agreeing to. And Jonah spoke first. "That's more than generous, Mr. Pruitt. We'll take you up on it." The older man nodded, satisfied, and stubbed out his cigarette. "Got 2 more loads coming this afternoon. My boys are bringing them up. Between what I can spare and what you've got on hand should be enough to get your barn roof framed and your house patched proper." He stayed long enough to help unload the first wagon, stacking lumber in the lee of the barn, with the unhurried efficiency of a man who'd done physical work every day of his life and saw no reason to stop. Then he climbed back up and drove out, and Jonah and Eliza stood in the yard, staring at the stacked boards like they were something miraculous. "Why did you tell him we're married?" Eliza asked. Her voice was careful, not accusatory, genuinely asking. Jonah didn't look at her. "Because telling him the truth raises questions we don't need right now. Because people out here understand a man and his wife working a ranch together. They don't understand indentured contracts and auction sales, and even if they did, the story it tells is the wrong one." He paused. "And because Pruitt brought that lumber, because he thinks we're a family trying to get back on our feet. You think he'd have done it if he knew the whole truth?" Eliza held that for a moment. "It's a lie. It's a convenience. There's a difference." "Is there?" Jonah finally looked at her. "If anyone asks you directly, you don't have to lie for me. I wouldn't ask that. But people believing something that keeps you safe and makes our lives possible, I'm not going to correct that." He turned back to the lumber. "Unless you want me to. It's your life they're believing things about." She thought about it. About what the truth sounded like spoken aloud. I was sold at auction, and he bought me, and about the face Pruitt would make hearing it, the way it would color every interaction afterward, the door it would open for men like Colfax to walk through with their legal arguments and their hungry eyes. "No," she said. "Don't correct it." Jonah nodded once. Back to work. The Pruitt boys arrived that afternoon. Thomas and James, young men in their 20s, with their father's quiet efficiency and their mother's apparent policy against unnecessary conversation. They worked beside Jonah without being asked what to do, reading the situation and filling in where they were needed. And by the time the light started going gold, the barn had the skeleton of a new roof rising from the wreckage of the old. Eliza cooked for 4 that evening venison she'd been saving, beans, biscuits, the last of the preserved apples stewed sweet. The table was too small, and the elbows bumped, and the biscuits were passed back and forth 3 times before everyone had enough, and it was the most alive the house had felt since she'd arrived. "Your wife's a fine cook, Mr. Reed," Thomas said around a mouthful of venison. Jonah's eyes found Eliza's across the table. Something moved through them, warm and complicated, and over before she could read all of it. "I know it," he said simply. After the Pruitts had ridden out with promises to return, Jonah and Eliza stood in the yard watching the dust settle. "They're good people," Eliza said. "This country's full of them once you get past the bad ones." Is that supposed to be comforting? The ghost of that smile again. More or less. Eliza looked at the barn, its new skeleton standing clean against the evening sky, raw lumber bright and full of promise, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Pride. Not the defensive armor-plated pride she'd worn for 22 years, the pride that said, "I don't need anything from anyone." Something softer. The pride of having made something alongside someone else. The pride of a life being built instead of just endured. That night after supper, Jonah was drying dishes while Eliza put away the last of the pots, and he said without looking at her, "We should go into town." She felt the words land in her stomach like a stone. "I'd rather not." "I know, but hiding out here only confirms what they already think." He set down the towel. "We need to walk into Ashford Bend and let people see us as what we are, a married couple running a ranch. That's the story. We need to live it in front of them, not just out here where nobody can see." "What we are," she repeated quietly. He looked at her, and something in his expression was careful and unguarded at the same time. "I know what I said about it being a convenience. I know that's how it started." A pause. "But you saved my horse. You stitched up my head in the dark. You stayed when you could have run." He held her gaze. "That's not nothing, Eliza. Whatever we want to call it, that's not nothing." She thought about the tack room, about his arm around her shoulders, and his coat over both of them, and the way the storm had roared outside, while something quieter had started inside. She thought about how she'd been watching for the lie for 3 weeks now, and hadn't found one, and how the watching was starting to feel less like vigilance and more like habit she didn't know how to break. "All right," she said. "We'll go to town." That night she took Sarah's boots off and held them in her lap in the lamplight, turning them over, feeling the softness of the leather broken in and shaped to feet that weren't hers. She thought about the woman who'd worn them. This woman Jonah still grieved with a grief so real it lived in his hands, in the way he moved through rooms, in the careful distance he kept, as if getting too close to someone again might take them from him faster. She didn't know Sarah Reed. She only knew the space she'd left behind. But she thought she understood something about her, because any woman who could make a man like Jonah Reed promise to be better at her graveside and then die trusting him to keep it was a woman worth being careful with. "I'm not replacing you," she thought, looking at the boots. "I'm just borrowing your ground a little while." Morning came clear and cold, the storm-washed sky so blue it almost hurt. Eliza dressed in her best, which was still the same worn shift since the blue wool dress wasn't finished yet, and braided her hair and pinned it, and tried to look like a woman who belonged somewhere. They drove to Ashford Bend with the sun just clearing the peaks, and when the town came into view below them, Eliza felt her hands go cold. "You don't have to do this," Jonah said. "Yes, I do." She straightened her spine. "Let's get it over with." He pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and came around to her side and offered his hand. She took it. Let him help her down. Felt the stairs hit her like weather not violent but present everywhere, unavoidable. Feldman behind the counter had his careful neutral face on when they walked in. "Mr. Reed, what can I do for you?" "Window glass 3x4, box of 10-penny nails, and I'll look at your fabric." Feldman's eyes went to Eliza. "Fabric. My wife needs a proper dress. What she's wearing is falling apart." The word wife dropped into the space between all three of them and sat there. Feldman's mouth opened. Closed. Opened. "I wasn't aware you'd that is congratulations, Mr. Reed. I suppose." "It was private," Jonah said evenly. "We didn't see the need for a big announcement." He led Eliza to the bolts of fabric along the side wall. Mostly calico, mostly practical. But there was one bolt of dark blue wool, simple and well woven, and Eliza's breath caught at the sight of it. "That one," Jonah said before she could speak. "It's expensive. 5 yards." He said it to Feldman, who was already moving to cut it. Then quieter, just for her. "You can't keep wearing rags. It's not right, and it doesn't do either of us any good." He paused. "Let people see that you're cared for. Let them see that this is real." There was something underneath the practicality of it, something that had nothing to do with appearances, and everything to do with a man who understood that dignity mattered, that the small visible signs of being valued were not vanity, but necessity for a woman who'd spent 22 years being told she was worth nothing. She let him buy the fabric. At the counter, Feldman tallied everything with his face carefully blank, and Jonah counted out money from a leather purse that looked painfully thin afterward. They loaded the wagon without speaking, and it was as they were climbing up onto the seat that the voice came from across the street. "Well, well." Hiram Colfax, Porter beside him, both of them moving across the street with the deliberate pace of men who own the clock. The people on the boardwalk stopped. Watched. Because this was what they'd been waiting for, the real confrontation, the one the auction had promised, and the subsequent weeks had delayed. "Heard you survived the storm," Colfax said. "Shame about the barn." "We'll manage," Jonah said. He kept loading. "I'm sure you will. Especially now you've got a wife." Colfax's smile was a thing with teeth. "Funny thing though, I checked with the clerk's office. No record of any marriage license issued to Jonah Reed in the last 5 years." Jonah straightened slowly. "What we did or didn't file," he said, "is our business. Actually, it's everyone's business." Colfax raised his voice deliberately, intentionally, for the audience gathering on both boardwalks. "When a man buys a woman's labor contract and then starts calling her his wife without any legal marriage to back it up, that's fraud. That's using a legal arrangement to cover something that isn't legal at all." He turned to look at the crowd, making sure they were all listening. "I talked to a lawyer in Cheyenne. He says a contract like the one Reed holds can be challenged if there's evidence of misuse. Says a judge might look real unfavorably on this kind of arrangement." Eliza felt the street close in around her. This was it. This was the moment she'd been waiting for since the auction, the moment when everything Jonah had tried to build came apart in public, in front of everyone who'd ever looked at her like she was something shameful, while she stood on the street in her worn-out dress and had no ground to stand on. And then Jonah took her hand, right there, in the middle of the street, in front of every watching eye in Ashford Bend. His fingers laced through hers, solid, certain not a performance, or if it was the kind of performance that becomes true in the doing of it. "You want to challenge it in court, Colfax?" His voice was level, utterly calm. "Go ahead, file your papers, bring your Cheyenne lawyer." He paused. "But while you're doing all that, you might want to think about how it'll look when people start asking what you really wanted her for. What kind of man offers $10 for a woman on an auction block and then spends weeks trying to take her away from the man who paid $50? Another pause longer. Because I'm betting everyone in this town already knows the answer to that question. And I'm betting they don't like it. Colfax's face had gone dark red. You calling me a liar? I'm calling you exactly what you are. Jonah's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. And I'm telling you in front of every person on this street that if you come at my wife again through the courts, through the clerk's office, through any door you think you can find, I will make sure everyone in this territory knows your name and your intentions. Every rancher, every judge, every decent family from here to Cheyenne. He squeezed Eliza's hand once. Now get out of our way. We have work to do. He helped her onto the wagon seat, climbed up beside her, clicked his tongue, and the buckskin moved forward. Colfax had to step aside or be run over. He stepped aside. They drove out of Ashford Bend at a steady pace. Eliza's heart hammering so hard she was certain Jonah could feel it through their joined hands. She didn't speak until the town had dropped behind a rise and there was nothing ahead of them but open country. Stop, she said. He pulled the wagon to a halt. She turned to face him, and her eyes were burning in a way she hadn't expected, in a way she hadn't let them burn in front of anyone in a very long time. You defended me, she said, in front of all of them. Of course No. Her voice broke slightly, and she didn't try to fix it. Not of course. There is no of course about it. No one has ever done that for me. Not once. Not in my entire life. She pressed her free hand against her sternum, feeling her own heartbeat there fast and slightly wild. My mother stood on a street in that town and watched them tie my hands, and she didn't say a word. Thomas Greer told half the county what he'd done with me, and no one told him to stop. For 22 years, not one single person ever stood up and said that Eliza Hale was worth defending. Jonah was very still. You did, she said. You did without hesitating when it would have been so much easier to say nothing. Eliza. His voice was rough. What I did today was the least. It wasn't the least to me. She met his eyes, and she didn't look away, and for the first time she stopped searching his face for the lie. It was everything. He looked at her for a long moment. Something was moving in his expression. Something she was only beginning to learn the name of, some careful guarded thing that had been buried a long time and was uncertain whether the light was safe. Then everyone who came before me, he said, was a fool. She laughed a short, surprised sound that was also almost a sob and shook her head. The thing Colfax said about challenging the contract, she said when she'd steadied herself. Can he actually do it? Maybe. It'll take time and money, and he'll have to prove misconduct. As long as we're careful, as long as things stay proper, he won't have grounds. Jonah released her hand and rubbed his face. But it's a risk. Every time someone comes through town and hears our story and asks questions, it's a risk. Eliza looked at the road ahead of them for a long, quiet moment. Then she said, "What if we made it real?" He turned to look at her. "A real marriage," she said carefully. "Not just a word you used in Feldman's store or in front of Colfax. An actual license, filed with the clerk, legal and on record." She kept her voice steady. "If we were actually married, Colfax couldn't challenge the contract. There'd be no impropriety to argue. We'd just be a husband and wife running a ranch, and there'd be nothing he could do about it." Jonah stared at her. "I'm not asking for love," she said quickly. "I'm not asking for, I know what this is and what it isn't. But you need help on that ranch, and I need protection from men who think they can buy their way to whatever they want. A legal marriage gives us both those things." She held his gaze. "You've already called me your wife in front of half the county. This just makes it true." "What if you meet someone?" he asked. "What if in a year or two you find, then we'll deal with it then?" She said it plainly. But right now, this is what makes sense. This is what keeps both of us safe. Jonah was silent for so long that a hawk crossed the sky above them twice before he spoke. "If we do this," he said, his voice careful and absolute, "I want you to understand something. It doesn't change what I already promised. Your own room, your own space, your own choices. Marriage license or not, you're your own person. And when the 7 years are done, if you want to leave, you can. I will not use a marriage to cage you. That is not what this is." "I know. I mean it, Eliza." His eyes were fierce. "I've watched men use legal arrangements to trap women their whole lives. I will not be one of those men." She looked at him. This man who'd been failing at a ranch for years and still kept the fences mended. Who'd loved a woman enough to promise at her grave to be better. Who'd looked at a woman roped to an auction platform and seen a human being instead of a bargain. "Then what is it?" she asked softly. "It's two people choosing," he said. "It's a partnership. It's whatever we decide it is." Eliza held out her hand. "Partners, then." He took it. They shook on it. Two people making a deal in the middle of a road with nothing around them but open sky and the mountains standing witness. Then Jonah clicked his tongue and the wagon rolled forward, carrying them back toward a ranch that needed rebuilding and a future that was uncertain in almost every way, except one: it was theirs. They were going to shape it themselves. 3 days later, they were married. Jonah rode to the county seat and returned with a circuit judge who read the legal language without expression, had them both sign the certificate, signed it himself, and was back on his horse before the ink was fully dry. $5 for his trouble. No ceremony, no witnesses. Eliza stood in the front room afterward, holding the certificate in both hands, reading her name in the official script. Eliza Reed. Strange, like a key that didn't quite fit yet, but would give in time. "It's done," Jonah said. He was at the window, his back to her, looking at the mountains. "You're protected now. Colfax can't touch the contract, can't claim impropriety. You're my legal wife, and that makes you safe." Safe. She turned the word over. Let herself feel the weight of it, this word she'd spent 22 years doing without. "Thank you," she said. He turned and his expression was complicated in the way that honest things are complicated. "Don't thank me for doing what should have been done from the start. You shouldn't have needed to marry someone to be safe." "But I did, and you gave me that." She folded the certificate carefully, precisely. "That means something." He nodded, seemed to gather himself. "Pruitt's boys are coming this afternoon. I should get back to the barn. I'll make food. They'll be hungry." It was the most ordinary exchange in the world. Domestic practical, the kind of conversation that happened 1,000 times a day in 1,000 households across the territory. But it felt momentous to Eliza, this easy division of purpose, this quiet understanding that they were pointed in the same direction. Jonah left. She stood alone in the room and looked through her open door at the narrow bed, at the blue wool fabric draped over the chair, at the small shelf where she'd begun keeping things, a smooth river stone, a hawk's feather wildflowers pressed flat between the pages of an almanac. Small things, private things. The accumulation of a person deciding one day at a time that her life was worth decorating. She went to the kitchen and began cooking. The Pruitt boys worked through the afternoon, and by evening the barn roof was framed solid, and the house had new shingles on the worst section, and the broken window was replaced with proper glass. When they all sat down to eat Eliza's venison, her biscuits, her stewed apples, the small house felt full in a way that had nothing to do with the number of bodies in it. "Your wife's a fine cook, Mr. Reed," Thomas said again. It seemed to be his standard assessment of meals he enjoyed. Jonah looked at Eliza across the table, and this time she held his gaze, instead of looking away. And this time, what passed between them wasn't complicated or guarded or searching for the lie. It was simply two people at their own table, in their own home, deciding to be glad of it. After the Pruitts rode out, they stood in the yard together in the evening quiet. "We should stop sleeping in separate rooms," Eliza said. Jonah went very still. "I'm not asking for anything," she said quickly. "I know what you promised, and I'm not asking you to take it back. But the Pruitts will talk. Neighbors will visit. If they figure out we sleep in separate rooms, it gives Colfax exactly the ammunition he's looking for." She kept her voice practical, matter-of-fact, though her heart was going somewhat faster than the conversation required. "We share the room. You take one side, I take the other. We keep the arrangement proper. but we stopped giving people reasons to ask questions. Jonah was quiet for a long time. "The bed's big enough for two if we're careful," he said finally. "We put a line of blankets down the middle. You stay on your side, I stay on mine. The moment you're uncomfortable, you say so." "Agreed. I mean it. Immediately. No questions asked." "I understand." He looked at her in the fading light, and she could see him working at something internally, fighting his way through grief and caution, and the terrible responsibility of being trusted by someone who'd never been able to trust anyone. "This wasn't what I expected," he said quietly. "When I bid on you, I was only thinking about getting you off that platform, about giving you somewhere to land that wasn't cruel." He paused. "I wasn't thinking about any of this. Neither was I. And now—" He stopped, started again. "You've become someone I don't want to fail. Someone whose opinion of me matters more than it probably should. And that—" His voice roughened. "That scares me more than Colfax does." Eliza felt something unlock in her chest, slow and irreversible. "You haven't failed me," she said. "You've done the exact opposite." She took a breath. "And I think maybe that scares me more than anything too. Because I've spent 22 years expecting the worst, and you keep not being the worst, and I don't know what to do with that yet." "Neither do I," Jonah said. "So we figure it out. Together. Together." That night, Eliza moved her few possessions from the small room to theirs. The blue fabric, the comb, the river stone, the feather, the pressed flowers. Everything she owned fit in her arms in one trip, which would have been sad a month ago. It didn't feel sad now. It felt like the beginning of an accumulation. The rolled blanket down the center of the bed was both absurd and oddly tender, this physical line that said, "I see you, I keep my promises. I am not that kind of man." They climbed in from opposite sides and lay still in the darkness, hyper-aware, the way you're aware of new weight on a structure you're still learning to trust. "Good night," Jonah said. "Good night," she answered. Sleep came slowly. But somewhere in the dark, sometime before the owl stopped hunting and the house settled into its deepest quiet, Jonah reached across the rolled blanket and found her hand. Just her hand. Nothing more. He held it. She let him. Outside, the mountains were unchanged by any of it, enormous, patient, permanent. But inside the small house with the new shingles and the clean windows, something was changing that had no name yet. Something that had started as desperation and survival, and was becoming slowly and without fanfare, the thing that sometimes grows in the spaces where broken things are carefully tended. Eliza lay in the dark with Jonah's hand around hers and thought, "I am 39 years old, and this is the first time I have felt safe. Not saved, not rescued, not beholden to anyone's charity. Safe. As in the ground beneath her feet was real, and she had chosen to stand on it, and the man beside her had let her do the choosing. That was the whole of it. And the whole of it was enough. The days after the wedding certificate were quieter than Eliza expected. Not empty, the ranch never allowed for empty, but quieter, in the way that follows a decision that has been made and doesn't need to be made again. The question of what they were to each other had been answered on paper. What they were becoming to each other was a different question entirely, and neither of them was in a hurry to force that answer. The blue wool dress came together slowly by lamplight in the evenings after supper. Eliza would sit at the table with her needle and thread while Jonah read from the old book of poetry that had belonged to Sarah. His voice low and slightly self-conscious at first, as if he wasn't sure she'd want to hear it, then gradually settling into the rhythm of it, reading the way a man reads something he learned by heart long ago and is only now remembering he still knows. She never asked him to read. He never asked if she wanted to listen. It simply happened night after night until it became the shape of their evenings, the way coffee and cornbread had become the shape of their mornings. The dress took 12 days. When she finally put it on and stood before the small mirror on the bedroom wall, she didn't recognize herself at first. Not because she'd changed so drastically, but because the woman looking back at her wore something she'd chosen fitted to her own frame in a color she'd picked for herself. The woman in the mirror looked like someone who lived somewhere deliberately. Someone who had decided to take up space in the world and wasn't apologizing for it. "It suits you," Jonah said from the doorway. She startled. He'd come in so quietly she hadn't heard him, and she felt heat rise in her face. Not embarrassment exactly, but the particular vulnerability of being seen when you're in the middle of seeing yourself. "It's just fabric," she said. "It's more than that." He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his expression serious. "It's you deciding what you want to look like, instead of wearing whatever you were given." A pause. "That matters." Eliza smoothed the skirt with both hands. "We should go to church Sunday." His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "You think we're ready for that? I think waiting any longer makes it worse." She turned from the mirror to face him. "They need to see us as what we are. The longer we stay out here, the longer Colfax's version of things is the only version they hear." Jonah was quiet for a moment. Then, Sunday. They drove to Ashford Bend with the sun bright and the air carrying the first edge of autumn, that particular September coolness that didn't commit to cold but reminded you it was coming. Jonah wore his father's suit. Eliza wore the blue dress. They sat together in a pew near the back, and she kept her chin level and her hands folded and her face exactly as open and neutral as she could make it, while the congregation worked through the business of pretending not to stare. The preacher talked about sin and redemption in the circular way that preachers did, as if the concepts were rooms they kept walking through without ever deciding to leave. Eliza sat through all of it, sang the hymns in a voice that was slightly rough from disuse, and felt Jonah's voice beside her deeper, steadier, carrying the melody when hers faltered. After the service, the congregation gathered in the churchyard, and this was the real trial. Eliza had known it would be. Church was the formality. The churchyard was the judgment. Mrs. Yancey came first, because she always came first. "Mrs. Reed." The woman's voice was sugar over something harder. "What a lovely dress. Did you make it yourself?" "I did." "How industrious." A smile that had nothing warm in it. "It must be quite an adjustment. Going from your previous circumstances to being a rancher's wife." Eliza felt Jonah tense beside her. She pressed her fingers briefly against his arm, just once a message, and looked at Mrs. Yancey with all the steadiness she had. "Every change is an adjustment," she said pleasantly. "But I find that honest work and a good partner make any circumstance bearable." She held the woman's gaze just long enough to be clear she wasn't flinching. "How is your daughter, Mrs. Yancey? I heard she was unwell last month." Mrs. Yancey blinked. Whatever she'd expected, it wasn't. That wasn't grace, wasn't courtesy, wasn't a woman who knew how to redirect a conversation without breaking stride. Yes, she's recovered, thank you. I'm glad to hear it." And then Eliza simply turned to the next person who'd approached, leaving Mrs. Yancey with her mouth slightly open and nothing left to fire. Jonah said nothing, but she felt his arm relax under her fingers, and that was enough. They worked through the rest of the congregation the same way, Eliza patient and steady, and giving nobody the reaction they'd come for. Jonah solid beside her, his presence a quiet declaration that she was not standing alone on this ground. One by one, the conversations found their natural endings, and the people of Ashford Bend began to recalculate. Some would come around, some wouldn't. But the story was changing, and they all felt it. Then Colfax walked across the churchyard. The crowd went still. In that particular way, it went still around trouble. He looked at Eliza first, then at Jonah, and his face was carefully blank in the way that men's faces go blank when they've decided something and haven't announced it yet. "Reed," he said. "Colfax." A pause. Something working in Colfax's jaw. "I spoke out of turn the other day," he said. "Made accusations that weren't mine to make." Each word came out like something being pulled. "I won't be pursuing any legal challenges to the contract or the marriage." The silence around them was total. Jonah said, "Appreciated." Nothing more. No gloating, no pressing the advantage. Just two words and a nod, and Colfax walked away with whatever was left of his dignity, and the crowd dispersed slowly around them, like water finding its level. Eliza stood in the churchyard sunlight and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since August. Not gone, she knew men like Colfax well enough to know that one public backing down didn't mean surrender, but quieter, manageable. "What happened?" she said quietly. "Why did he back down?" Jonah watched Colfax's retreating back. "Edward Pruitt happened," he said. "Pruitt's been in this county 30 years. He knows every rancher, every judge, every county official within 100 miles. When he decided we were worth helping, that carried weight." A pause. "Men like Colfax don't fight battles they've already lost. He's calculating, not stupid. So it's over. For now." His voice was careful. "For now it's over." On the drive home, they stopped to buy supplies. Window putty, more nails, lamp oil, and Feldman called Eliza Mrs. Reed without any of the skepticism he'd wrapped around the word before. Small thing, but small things had been the architecture of her life for 22 years, and she'd learned to read them accurately. The story had changed. They were home before dark, and that evening, washing dishes side by side in the small kitchen, Jonah said, "You did well today." "I survived it." "You did more than survive it." He handed her a plate to dry. "You walked into the room where everyone had watched you be sold, and you held your head up, and you were gracious to people who didn't deserve it. That's not nothing." Eliza dried the plate and set it on the shelf. "My grandmother used to say that the best revenge for small-minded people was to refuse to become one." She paused. "I didn't believe her when I was young. I believe her now." Jonah was quiet for a moment. "What was she like, your grandmother?" The question surprised her, not because it was intrusive, but because nobody had asked her something like that in so long. Nobody had asked her about the people she came from, as if those people mattered, as if Eliza Hale had a history worth knowing. "Tough," she said. "Practical. She had a garden and she talked to everything in it like it could hear her." She felt a smile pull at the corner of her mouth. "I thought she was a little crazy when I was a child. Now I talk to tomato plants and I understand completely." Jonah laughed again, that short, rusty sound that was becoming less rare. "She died when I was 12, Eliza continued. "And after that it was just my mother and me. And my mother was—" She stopped, chose her words. "My mother was a woman who'd been disappointed by life and decided someone else was responsible for it. She wasn't cruel exactly. She was just absent. Even when she was standing right in front of you." Jonah dried his hands on the towel and turned to lean against the counter, listening with his full attention, the way he did when something mattered to him. "Is that why you believe Thomas Greer?" he asked. Not unkindly, just honestly. Eliza thought about it. "I believed him because I was 14 and hungry for someone to see me. And he saw me. Or he made me think he did." She set the last cup on the shelf. "The cruelest thing about being young and lonely is that anyone who pays you genuine attention looks like love." "You were 14 years old," Jonah said. "You didn't ruin your life. He did. And everyone who decided it was your fault instead of his was wrong." Eliza looked at him. "I know that now," she said. "It took me 22 years to know it, but I know it." "What would you tell her, the 14-year-old? She considered. "I'd tell her that being wanted by the wrong person isn't the same as being worthy of the right one. And that she was always worthy. She just hadn't met anyone decent enough to show her yet." The words hung in the air between them, and they both felt the weight of who she might have been talking about. Jonah straightened. "I'm going to check on the horses," he said, and his voice was rougher than usual. "Get some rest." He went outside, and Eliza stood in the kitchen alone, her hands pressed flat on the counter, and let herself feel the full force of what was growing between them, this careful, guarded, stubborn thing that neither of them had asked for, and both of them were becoming unable to imagine living without. October came in cold and sudden, the way it did in the high country one day, summer the next morning, a frost on the ground, and the aspens turning gold overnight. Eliza spent the first week of the month putting the garden to bed, cutting back what was finished. turning the soil over the roots of what would come back in spring, mounding earth around the plants that could still produce if the killing freeze held off another few weeks. She found herself thinking in terms of spring, planning for it. What she'd plant differently, what she'd expand. Whether there was room along the south wall of the barn for the herb garden she had a particular vision of. She was thinking in terms of next year. And the year after that. She noticed this. Filed it somewhere careful. The Pruitts came twice more in October, and each visit settled them deeper into the fabric of the community Edward Pruitt represented. By the third visit, Thomas and James were arriving at dawn without being asked and leaving at dark without being told. And Edward himself had taken to sitting with Eliza over coffee after supper and talking about the country, its seasons, its particular demands, the ways it broke people, and the ways it made them, with the easy frankness of someone who decided she was worth talking to, honestly. "You're good for him," Pruitt said one evening when the boys were still working and Jonah had stepped outside to check on the stock. He said it simply as a fact he'd observed. "Reed, he was going under before you got here. A man can manage on his own, but he can't live on his own. There's a difference." Eliza kept her hands around her coffee cup. He was managing. He was maintaining. Pruitt shook his head. There's a look a man gets when he's decided to just keep going until he can't anymore. Jonah had that look. He glanced at her. He doesn't have it now. Eliza didn't know what to say to that. "I'm not telling you to be his salvation," Pruitt said. "I'm just telling you what I see, and what I see is two people who are doing each other some good." He finished his coffee and stood. That's worth protecting. She was still thinking about those words 3 days later when the second letter arrived. Jonah brought it in from town with the supplies, a thick envelope with the territorial court seal on it, addressed to Eliza Reed. She opened it at the kitchen table with steady hands because she'd trained herself to open things that frightened her without flinching even when her stomach was doing something terrible. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time to make sure she understood. Jonah was watching her from across the table. He hadn't asked. He was giving her the silence to read it in the way he gave her all kinds of space, deliberately, consciously, as if he'd thought about what she needed before she knew herself. "The contract," she said. Her voice came out strange. "It's been dissolved. The marriage, our marriage, legally it superseded the contract. I'm not bound to the 7 years anymore." She looked up. "I'm free. It says I'm free." Jonah was very still. "Effective when?" he asked. "Now, as of the date of the marriage certificate." She set the letter on the table. 7 years gone. I can go. I can go anywhere. I don't owe anyone anything anymore." She said the words and listened to herself say them and waited to feel the relief she'd been saving up for 22 years, that massive, clean-sweeping relief of doors unlocking and weightlifting, and the future opening up like a road in flat country stretching as far as you could see. It didn't come. What came instead was a different feeling entirely, and it frightened her more than she expected. Jonah stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the deliberate stillness of a man who was being very careful about what he was feeling and how much of it he showed. "You're free," he said. "That's what we said. That's what I promised." "Yes." "You could leave today, tomorrow, whenever you want." "Yes." "Do you want to?" A long silence. "No," she said. He turned from the window. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to stay here, on this ranch with you, building what we've been building." Her voice was steady, steadier than she felt. "Not because I'm contracted to, not because I have nowhere else to go, because this is where I want to be." She held his gaze. "I'm choosing this. You. This life. I'm choosing it." Something broke open in Jonah's face quietly, the way things break open that have been held closed by effort rather than by nature. He crossed the room in 4 steps and stopped in front of her, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at the mountains on the day they'd arrived, like something he'd stopped believing he deserved to stand in front of. Eliza. Her name in his voice low and careful and full. I know, she said. I know it's complicated. I know you're still carrying Sarah. I know you're afraid of what this is. She stood from the table, and they were very close now, close enough that she could see the healed scar above his eye, the gray at his temples, the grief and the hope fighting it out in his expression. So am I. I'm terrified. I've been waiting for 22 years for the next thing to go wrong, and you keep not going wrong, and I don't know what to do with that yet. Neither do I, he said. So we figure it out. Together. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, felt the rough stubble, the warmth of his skin, the way his breath stilled at her touch. I'm choosing you, she said. Not because I have to. Because you're the first person in my life who let me make that choice. He kissed her. Carefully, the way he did everything, as if she were something he was afraid of holding too tight, as if getting this wrong would be the worst thing he'd ever done. She kissed him back, and put into it everything she didn't have words for, yet the 48 days of learning this man, the slow accumulation of all the ways he'd kept his word, the terrifying, wonderful weight of being seen by someone, and seen truly. When they finally pulled apart, they stayed close foreheads, almost touching. I should have said this a long time ago, Jonah said, but I wasn't sure I had the right. Say it now. I don't want you to go. His voice was rough. I don't want this to be temporary. I want... He stopped. Tried again. I want to do this right. A real marriage. Not just on paper. Everything. Then let's do it right, she said. Let's build something worth keeping. He smiled. Not the ghost of a smile. Not the rusty, hesitant, almost smile she'd been collecting like rare coins. A real one. Full and unguarded and startling in its warmth. She thought, there he is. There's the man underneath all that grief and all that caution. There he is. That evening, she took the letter from the territorial court outside to the fire pit. Jonah followed without being asked. She held the paper over the flames for a moment. This document that said she was free. This proof that she owed nothing, was bound to nothing, could walk away from everything without legal consequence. She let it go. It caught fast curled black at the edges, burned bright and brief, and was gone in seconds, scattered on the wind as ash. Why? Jonah asked. Because I don't need proof anymore. She leaned into his side, feeling his arm come around her waist, solid and certain. I can feel it. They stood together while the last of the ash scattered upward into the dark, and Eliza watched it go and felt something release in her that she hadn't known she was still holding. The last physical evidence of the auction, the contract, the 7 years. Gone. What remained was what they were building. But the world she knew was not finished with them yet. 3 days after she burned the letter, a rider came up the valley road at a gallop that said urgency. Not Colfax. She'd learned to read the difference between Colfax's deliberate swagger and genuine alarm. This was different. This was a young man from town, one of the clerk's boys, and he was out of breath before he'd finished dismounting. Mr. Reed, got a message from the county office. Thought you'd want it straight away. Jonah took the paper from him. Read it once. Read it again. His face went very still in the particular way that meant something was wrong. What is it? Eliza said. He handed her the paper. It was a legal notice. Formal language dense with courtroom phrasing, but the meaning was clear enough once you stripped away the formality. Hiram Colfax had filed a challenge after all, not to the marriage contract, not to Eliza's status, but to the deed of the ranch itself. He was claiming that Jonah Reed had purchased the property using fraudulent documentation, that the original land grant was improperly recorded, that under territorial law, the ranch, the house, the barn, the corral, every fence post and shingle and acre of ground they'd spent weeks rebuilding was subject to judicial review. Subject in Colfax's legal language to reversion of title. He wasn't coming after Eliza anymore. He was coming after everything. The rider left, and Jonah and Eliza stood in the yard holding the paper between them, and the silence had a different quality now. Not the comfortable silence of two people who'd said enough, but the sharp electric silence of a problem that had just changed its shape. "He can't actually do this," Eliza said. "Can he? He can file anything he wants." Jonah's voice was flat. The flatness of a man who'd just had solid ground shift under his feet and was finding his balance. "Doesn't mean he'll win, but it means we have to fight it. Means we need a lawyer and the county hearing and—" He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. "Means he found a way around the contract and the marriage both. How does he have grounds? You have the deed. He says the deed is fraudulent." Jonah looked at the paper again. The original land grant, the one the previous owner filed Colfax, is claiming it was never properly recorded with the territorial office, if he can prove that the whole chain of title falls apart. Is he right? A long pause. "I don't know," Jonah said, and the honesty of it hit hard. "I bought this place from a man named Garrett, who'd been on it 15 years. I saw the deed had the clerk record the transfer, but whether Garrett's original grant was properly filed?" He shook his head. "I don't know." Eliza looked at the paper in her hands. At the official seal, the dense language, the particular ugliness of a man using legal machinery to take what he couldn't buy or intimidate his way into. "Then we find out," she said. "Eliza, we find out what Garrett filed and when, and whether it was done right, and if there's a problem, we fix it, and if there isn't one, we prove it." She looked at him. "You told Colfax you'd fight it in front of a judge, so we fight it in front of a judge. A lawyer costs money we don't have. Edward Pruitt knows every official in this county. He said so himself." She folded the paper with deliberate hands. "We go to him. We ask for help. You said yourself that asking for help is what you should have done differently with Sarah. So ask." Something moved across Jonah's face, the particular flinch of a man whose own words have been used as an argument against him, fairly used with care. "You're right," he said quietly. "I know." They rode to Pruitt's ranch the next morning, arriving before the breakfast dishes were cleared, and Edward Pruitt listened to the whole story over coffee. The auction, the contract, the marriage. Colfax's pattern of pursuit, and now the deed challenge with the patient. Unshockable expression of a man who'd seen most of what human nature was capable of, and had long since decided to deal with facts rather than feelings about them. When Jonah finished, Pruitt was quiet for a moment. "Garrett filed that grant in '71, he said finally. "I was at the land office the same week. Remember thinking he'd done it sloppily, didn't have one of the survey markers documented right." He picked up his coffee. "Could be that's what Colfax found." Jonah's jaw tightened. "So he has grounds. He has a question to raise. That's not the same as grounds." Pruitt set down the cup. "There's a land attorney in Cheyenne name of Whitmore. He's handled 4 or 5 grant challenges in this territory, won most of them. He doesn't work cheap, but he works right." He looked at Jonah steadily. "I'll front you the retainer." "I can't ask you to." "You didn't ask. I offered." Pruitt's voice was matter-of-fact. "That's different. You're good people trying to hold something together, and Colfax is a bully with money and too much time. I've watched men like him run good people off good land my whole life, and I'm tired of it." He pushed back from the table. "I'll send a rider to Whitmore today. You'll hear back within the week." Jonah sat with that for a moment. Then, Why do you keep helping us?" Pruitt looked at him with the slight impatience of a man being asked to explain something obvious. "Because your wife hauled water to my boys for 3 days while they were putting your roof on and never once treated it like charity she was owed. Because you mended my fence without being reminded of the agreement. Because decent people should be able to keep what they've worked for." He stood. "That's why." On the ride home, Jonah was quiet for most of it. Not the quiet of sadness, something more like reckoning. Working something through. Eliza let him work. Finally, he said, "I owe you an apology." She glanced at him. "For what?" "For every time I've let my pride get in the way of asking for help. For letting Sarah carry more than she should have, because I was too stubborn to admit the ranch needed more than I could give alone." He watched the road. and for assuming you'd be the same, that you'd work yourself to pieces and never ask for anything because that's what I was doing. I almost made the same mistake twice." "You didn't, though," Eliza said. "I almost did. Almost doesn't count." She looked at him. "You asked Pruitt. You let me come with you today. You're learning." A pause. "We both are." Whitmore's letter arrived 6 days later, and it was the first piece of good news they'd gotten from any official source in the entire time Eliza had been at the ranch. The attorney had reviewed the original Garrett filing and found yes, one survey marker improperly documented, but he'd also found that under territorial law, a 15-year period of uncontested occupancy and improvement constituted adverse possession, which could override the documentation error entirely. The hearing, he wrote, was winnable. He'd take it. Jonah read the letter aloud at the kitchen table, and when he finished, he set it down and pressed both hands flat on the surface and exhaled once, long and slow. "It's not over," Eliza said. "No, but it's possible." He looked up. "It's actually possible." "It was always possible," she said. "You just needed someone to tell you so." He reached across the table and took her hand openly, easily, the way he was beginning to do things that once would have cost him deliberate effort. Like trust was becoming habit. Like she was becoming the person he reached for when the weight of something needed to be shared. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. She waited. "When I bid on you at that auction, I told you it was because no one else would, and that was true." He held her gaze. "But it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth is that I'd seen you before. In town maybe 3 or 4 times over the years. You were always working, carrying something, mending, something moving quickly, like you were always trying to stay ahead of something catching up to you. And I thought every time—" He stopped. "I thought that woman works like she's got everything to prove and no one to prove it to. That's a lonely way to live." Eliza felt her throat tighten. "And then they put you on that platform," he said. "And I thought I know what it is to work that hard in a place that doesn't see you. I know what it is to put everything into something and watch people look right through it." He paused. "I didn't bid on you because you were a bargain. I bid on you because I recognized you." The words landed in the deepest part of her. "Jonah," she said, and her voice was unsteady. "I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid telling you would sound like—" He shook his head. "I don't know. Like I was claiming something, and you'd had enough of men claiming things." "You're not claiming anything," she said. "You're just—" She stopped, tried again. "You're just telling me the truth. And the truth is—" She pressed her free hand over her heart. "The truth is that I have been seen by you since before I knew it was happening. And that is the most terrifying and the most wonderful thing that has ever happened to me." He stood. She stood. They met in the middle of the small kitchen, and when he put his arms around her, it was different from the tack room in the storm. Not shelter, not survival, not 2 people trying to take up less space. It was simply 2 people choosing each other in full daylight without emergency to justify it. "I love you," he said into her hair, rough and certain and slightly startled by his own voice saying it. "I didn't plan for that, but there it is." She tightened her arms around him and felt tears run down her face for the first time since she'd stood on that auction platform. Not grief tears, not shame tears, but the kind that come when something you'd given up on comes back to you in a form better than you'd imagined. "I love you too," she said. "God help me, I love you too." Outside, the aspens were burning gold against the mountains, and the creek was running clear, and Henrietta the red hen was conducting her daily reign of terror over the coop, and the barn stood solid with its new roof, and all of it was theirs. All of it still at risk. The hearing was coming. Colfax wasn't finished. The territorial court would have its say, and Whitmore would argue, and the judge would rule, and the outcome was not guaranteed. But they were facing it together, and Eliza Reed, who had spent 22 years waiting for the bottom to fall out, had finally found ground that held. The hearing was set for the 3rd Thursday of November, 6 weeks after Whitmore had taken the case. 6 weeks was a long time to live with something hanging over your head, and Eliza and Jonah lived with it the way you live, with bad weather. You can see coming on the horizon. You didn't stop working, didn't stop eating, didn't stop sleeping side by side in the dark, with his hand finding hers sometime in the night without either of them deciding to do it. You just kept moving. You did the next thing, and the thing after that, and you didn't look at the horizon more than you had to, but it was always there. Whitmore came to the ranch twice in those 6 weeks. He was a compact, precise man from Cheyenne, with ink-stained fingers and the habit of asking questions that seemed simple until you were halfway through answering them and realized they weren't. He sat at Eliza's kitchen table and drank her coffee and walked Jonah through every detail of the original purchase, every conversation with Garrett, every document signed, every trip to the clerk's office, every improvement made to the land in the years since. After the second visit, Whitmore sat back in his chair and looked at them both. "Colfax's lawyer is good," he said. "I want you to understand that. He found a real problem in the Garrett filing, and he's going to argue it well." "But," Jonah said, "but adverse possession in this territory requires 10 years of continuous, open, uncontested improvement. You've got 12. I've got your tax records, your filed improvements, 3 neighbors prepared to testify. They've watched you work this land without interruption." He tapped the stack of papers on the table. "Colfax's lawyer found a crack in your foundation. I'm going to show the judge that the building is still standing." "Will it be enough?" Eliza asked. Whitmore looked at her. "I think so. I don't say that lightly." A pause. "But I've been wrong before." After he left, Eliza and Jonah sat at the table in the quiet that he'd left behind, and Jonah said, "If we lose, we won't. But if we do..." He looked at her steadily. "I need you to know that I will find another piece of land. It might not be this valley, might not be this creek, might not be any of the particular ground we've been standing on. But I will build something for us. I won't let this be the end." Eliza looked at him. "I know. I need you to actually know it, not just say it. Jonah." She reached across the table and took his face in both hands, the way she had in the tack room during the storm, tilting it so he had to look at her directly. "I was 39 years old and barefoot on an auction platform when you walked out of the hardware store's shadow and bid $50 on my life. If you think losing a land dispute is going to be the thing that breaks us, you don't know what we're made of." He covered her hands with his. "What are we made of? The kind of people," she said, "who don't quit." He turned his head and pressed his lips against her palm briefly, fiercely. "The kind of people who don't quit," he agreed. The morning of the hearing, Eliza was awake before 3 o'clock, lying in the dark, listening to Jonah's steady breathing and running the whole story through her head the way she'd been doing for weeks. The auction, the contract, the storm, the marriage certificate, the letter from the territorial court, and now this hearing that would decide whether all of it had been for something or had just been practice for starting over. She got up quietly and went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table with it, and after a while she heard his door, their door open, and his bare feet on the floor, and he appeared in the doorway, his hair disheveled and his eyes already awake. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. "No." He poured himself coffee and sat across from her, and they drank in silence for a while, the way they'd learned to share silence, not as absence, but as presence, as two people close enough that words were optional. "Whatever happens today," Jonah said, "I need to say something first." She waited. "I was a man who'd stopped believing anything good could still happen to him," he said. "After Sarah, after the years of barely holding this place together, I'd gotten to a point where I was just waiting. Not for anything specific. Just waiting for it to be over." He looked at his cup. "And then I saw you on that platform, and something woke up in me that I thought was dead. And I don't know if that was God or luck or just the particular accident of standing in the right shadow at the right moment, but..." He looked up. "You woke me back up, Eliza. Whatever the judge says today, I need you to know that." Eliza felt the tears before she decided to cry, and she let them come this time. Not the controlled, Careful not crying she'd practiced for 22 years, but actual tears running down her face in the gray pre-dawn kitchen while the coffee cooled and the man she loved told her the truth. "You did the same thing for me," she said. "You know that." "I know." "Then let's go win this," she said, "and come home." They drove to the county seat in the cold morning dark, arriving as the sun was just starting to show itself over the eastern ridgeline. The courthouse was a 2-story wood frame building that smelled of pine resin and paper, and the particular staleness of rooms where important things were decided. Whitmore was already there, his papers organized, his ink-stained hands steady. Edward Pruitt was there too, which Eliza hadn't expected. He was sitting in the gallery with Thomas and James on either side of him, all three of them in their Sunday clothes. All three of them with the settled, patient look of men who'd made a decision and were prepared to sit with it as long as necessary. Jonah stopped when he saw them. "You didn't have to come." "I'm testifying," Pruitt said simply. Whitmore asked. "I said yes." He looked at Jonah with the mild directness of a man who considered further explanation unnecessary. "Sit down. It's starting." Colfax came in 2 minutes later with his lawyer, a tall man from Cheyenne named Aldrich, who wore his suit like armor and moved through the room with the confidence of someone who'd won most of the arguments he'd ever been in. He didn't look at Eliza. That deliberate not looking told her everything about how aware of her he actually was. Colfax looked at her. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes held the particular flatness of a man who'd recalculated and decided he was still going to win just differently than he'd originally planned. He'd given up on getting her. He was going to take the land instead. She met his gaze and held it. He looked away first. The judge was a heavy-set man named Cowboy, with a gray beard and reading spectacles, and the unhurried manner of someone who'd been settling disputes in this territory for 20 years, and had long since stopped being surprised by human nature. He read through the filing, asked several questions of both attorneys in a flat procedural tone, and then called for testimony. Aldrich went first. He laid out Colfax's argument with crisp precision, the survey marker error in Garrett's original filing, the territorial statute requiring complete documentation for land grants, the legal principle that a chain of title was only as strong as its weakest link. He was good. Whitmore had been right about that. He made the error sound not like a technicality, but like a structural failure, like a house built on a cracked foundation that had been hoping nobody would look too closely. Eliza sat beside Jonah and kept her hands still in her lap and watched the judge's face and tried to read it. She couldn't. His expression was the professional blankness of a man who understood that his face was a document everyone in the room was trying to read and who'd learned to write nothing on it. Then Whitmore stood up. He didn't start with the law. He started with the land. He called Jonah first and walked him through 12 years on that property, the first winter he'd spent patching a roof that was already failing when he bought it, the drought of '78 that had killed half his herd and nearly killed the ranch, the flood 2 years later that had taken out the lower fence line and required 3 months of work to repair. He walked him through every tax payment filed, every improvement recorded, every season of work that had gone into the ground of that valley. Jonah answered in the steady, unembellished way he did everything. No performance, no drama, just facts delivered by a man who'd lived them. Eliza watched the judge's pen move twice while Jonah was talking. That meant something. She didn't know what, but it meant something. Then Whitmore called Pruitt. Edward Pruitt took the stand with the unhurried authority of a man who'd been in this county since before most of the people in the room were born, and he looked at the judge, the way old men look at people. They've decided to be honest with regardless of consequences. "I've watched Jonah Reed work that valley for 12 years, he said. "I watched him buy it from Garrett fair and square. I watched him file his transfer at the county office. I was there the same day. I watched him build on it and improve it and pay his taxes on it every year without fail." He paused. "And I watched Hiram Colfax try to buy a woman at auction for $10 and get outbid and then spend 3 months trying to find a way to take something from a man who wouldn't sell him what he wanted." Aldrich was on his feet instantly. "Objection. Witness is characterizing my client's motivations." "Sustained," said Calloway. "Mr. Pruitt, please confine your testimony to observable facts." "Yes, sir." Pruitt's expression didn't change. Observable fact, Jonah Reed has worked that land for 12 years. Observable fact, it has been improved continuously in that time. Observable fact, no one challenged his title until he refused to sell a labor contract to Hiram Colfax. He looked at the judge steadily. Those are the facts I observed. Aldrich's cross-examination was sharp and well-aimed. But Pruitt was the kind of witness who didn't rattle. And when Aldrich sat back down, the damage he'd hoped to do hadn't been done. Then Whitmore called Eliza. She hadn't known he was going to. He hadn't told her. She felt Jonah go still beside her, felt the surprised tension in him, and she put her hand briefly on his arm. "It's all right," and stood up and walked to the witness stand. Whitmore asked her only 3 questions. How long had she been on the Reed property? What condition she had found it in when she arrived? And what she had observed of Jonah Reed's relationship to that land in the time since. She answered the first 2 simply and factually, the way she'd answered questions from people with power over her whole life clearly, without embellishment, without giving them more than they asked for. Then she answered the 3rd one honestly. "I've watched him work that land every day since August," she said. "I've watched him get up before dawn and come in after dark and make decisions about that property the way a man makes decisions about something he intends to keep. Not like a man who's borrowing something or waiting for something better. Like a man who's home." She paused. "There is no part of that ranch that hasn't had his hands on it. No fence post he hasn't touched, no acre he hasn't turned over. That land knows him." She looked at the judge. "And he knows it the way you know a thing you've poured yourself into." The courtroom was very quiet. Calloway looked at her over his reading spectacles. "Thank you, Mrs. Reed." Aldrich declined to cross-examine her. She walked back to her seat and sat down, and Jonah took her hand under the table and held it, and she felt the tremor in his grip. Not fear, she knew him well enough now to know the difference, but the particular unsteadiness of someone who has just heard themselves described by someone who loves them and is not yet entirely accustomed to being seen that clearly. Closing arguments took 40 minutes. Whitmore was precise and methodical, building his case brick by careful brick: adverse possession, documented improvement, continuous occupancy. The principle that territorial law existed to protect working people who built something from nothing, not to serve as a weapon for men with money and grievances. Aldrich was sharp and legal and entirely correct about the technical flaw in Garrett's filing, and he argued it well. Then Calloway called a recess. 45 minutes. Eliza and Jonah sat on a bench outside the courthouse in the cold November air, and Pruitt brought them coffee from somewhere, and nobody said much because there was nothing useful left to say. Everything that could be done had been done. The rest was out of their hands. Jonah sat with his forearms on his knees and his coffee cup between his palms and stared at the ground. "Whatever he decides," he said quietly, "I meant what I said this morning. I know. I'll build us something. It might take time, but—" "Jonah." She put her hand on his back between his shoulder blades, flat and steady. "Stop building contingencies. We did everything right. Let it be enough." He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned his head to look at her. "When did you get so calm?" he said. "About 10 minutes ago," she said honestly. "I'm terrified. I'm just choosing not to show it." He laughed. That real laugh, the one that was becoming less rare. "There she is," he said softly. "There's the woman who went back into that storm for my horse. Don't remind me. I still think that was insane." "It was," he said. "It was also the moment I knew." "Knew what?" He looked at her. "That I was in serious trouble." Before she could respond, the courthouse door opened and Whitmore appeared, his face carefully composed, and he said, "The judge is ready." They went back inside. Calloway came in from his chambers and sat down and put on his reading spectacles and looked at the papers in front of him with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who was going to say what he had to say and say it once. "The court has reviewed the filing record for the original Garrett land grant," he said, "and confirms that the survey documentation contained an error that would, under strict interpretation of the recording statute, constitute an incomplete filing." He paused. "However," Eliza stopped breathing. The territorial legislature in its 1874 revision of the Land Code established the doctrine of adverse possession, specifically to address situations in which good faith purchasers have occupied and improved land without contest for a period exceeding 10 years, regardless of documentary irregularities in prior title. The legislature's intent was explicit to protect working people who have built something on this land from being dispossessed by technical challenges brought after the fact. He looked up from the papers over his spectacles directly at Colfax. Mr. Reed has occupied, improved, and paid taxes on this property for 12 years. His record is uncontested and unimpeachable. The challenge brought by Mr. Colfax does not meet the threshold required to overcome adverse possession under territorial law. He set down the papers. The deed stands. The challenge is dismissed. Court costs are assessed to the challenger. He picked up his gavel. We're adjourned. The gavel came down. Eliza felt the sound of it go through her like something physical, a reversal, a resolution, a door closing on the last 2 months of fear and threat, and the grinding uncertainty of waiting to find out if the life they'd built together was going to be allowed to continue. The deed stood. They were home. Jonah sat completely still for 3 seconds. Then he exhaled a long, shaking breath and put his face in his hands. Eliza put her arm around him. She felt him pull himself back together, the way he did everything from the inside out, quiet and without drama. When he lifted his head, his eyes were bright, and he didn't try to hide it. Across the room, Colfax stood with his jaw tight and his lawyer already packing papers, and he looked at Eliza once, not with hatred, not with the hungry calculation she'd come to recognize, but with something that was almost the look of a man who understood he'd lost something more than a legal argument. He'd lost the particular pleasure of believing that the world owed him access to whatever he decided he wanted. She looked back at him without anger, without triumph either. Just the level, steady gaze of a woman who no longer had any use for him. He looked away. Pruitt clapped Jonah on the shoulder, hard enough to stagger him slightly, and Thomas and James were grinning, and Whitmore was shaking hands, and the courthouse was noise and movement, and the ordinary chaos of a thing concluded. Eliza stood in the middle of it, and felt for the first time in her adult life like the noise was happening around someone who belonged in the room, not someone tolerated, not someone managed. Someone who had every right to be standing exactly where she was. They drove home in the late afternoon, the sun already dropping toward the western peaks, the air cold and clean and carrying the first real suggestion of the winter that was finally coming in earnest. Neither of them talked much. The silence was the good kind, full rather than empty, weighted with everything that had been said and decided and survived. Halfway home, Jonah reached over and took her hand. Just that. She laced her fingers through his and looked at the mountains coming into view ahead of them, and thought about the morning she'd sat on this same wagon seat and watched Ashford Bend disappear behind her, and tried to prepare herself for the worst. She hadn't been able to prepare for this. For the particular way the worst doesn't always come for the way sometimes rarely against every expectation and experience. The thing that happens instead is something worth having. When they pulled into the yard and Jonah set the brake, he sat for a moment before climbing down, looking at his ranch, at the solid barn, with its new roof at the house, with its clean windows and the curl of smoke already rising from the chimney. Because she'd banked a fire before they left that morning at the corral, where Dove stood patient and warm-breathed in the cold at the garden rows, turned down for winter, but already holding the seeds of next spring in its frozen ground. Still standing, he said. Still ours, she said. He helped her down from the wagon, and they stood together in the yard in the last of the afternoon light, and she felt his arms come around her from behind his chin, resting on the top of her head. Both of them facing the mountains that had been standing there since before anyone in this story was born, and would be standing there long after. Eliza. Her name in his voice, quiet and certain, and full of everything the last 3 months had built between them. I know, she said. I haven't said it enough. You've said it every single day, she told him. Just not always with words. He tightened his arms around her. Inside, the lamp was already lit, throwing a warm square of gold into the yard through the kitchen window. The coffee would be cold, but she'd reheat it. There was venison in the larder, and the last of the autumn squash, and enough flour for biscuits, and they would sit at their table in their kitchen in their house, and eat their supper, and talk about tomorrow's work the way married people did. And tomorrow, Eliza would go back to her garden plans, and Jonah would start the winter repairs on the south fence, and Henrietta would conduct her daily reign of terror over the chickens, and the mountains would stand there being mountains, and all of it would be ordinary, and all of it would be theirs. This was what she'd burned that letter for. Not the freedom to leave, the freedom to stay. She turned in his arms to face him, and kissed him once firm and clear in the cold November air, with the mountains watching. "Come inside," she said. "Come home." And Jonah Reed, who had spent 2 years waiting to stop hurting, who had learned too late that asking for help was not the same as failing, who had walked out of a hardware store's shadow one August morning and bid $50 on a woman the whole town had decided was worth nothing. Jonah Reed smiled at his wife with his whole face and said, "I'm already there." They walked into the house together, and the door closed behind them, and the lamp burned steady in the window, and outside, the mountains stood their watch over a valley where two broken people had found each other at the end of hope and decided against all evidence and experience to build something worth keeping. They built it. They kept it. And that, in the end, was the whole of the story, and it was enough.